Portal Stormer, Chapter 3. Meet the Portal Stormers. Before Delwyn travelled through the mirror pendant, she'd assumed that she'd end up back in the Ural's palace with Morpheus and possibly Varun. She didn't expect to find herself standing on a shiny black floor the size of a basketball court, suspended in space. She turned around to try and see if anyone else was there, but she seemed to be alone. She called out, "Hello?" Then the familiar hissing began, and it was the first time she felt relieved to hear it, as it was frightening to be stuck out there on her own. Varun appeared at the far left corner, this time a rich mahogany brown with white eyes. He seemed like a normal seahorse for once, apart from his torso and arms, so she started to walk over to him, but he put out his hands to stop her. He didn't speak, and she could tell by his disposition that something was wrong. She backed up a few steps and waited for further instructions. The hissing then slowly subsided, only to be replaced by the fluttering of wings coming from every direction. She knew that it meant that Morpheus was coming, but she wasn't expecting the large brown bat that she'd seen at the entrance of the cave, or the silvery grey one, slightly smaller, alongside it. The brown bat came down and floated above the far right of the corner of the floor, and the silver bat flew over Delwyn's head and hovered behind her. Every time she turned to look, it bared its teeth at her, so she kept still, staring at Varun, trying to figure out what was happening. She'd assumed that she was going to be initiated, which was why she'd worn her favourite black velvet dress and red velvet boots. She didn't even think about a portal stormer needing pants, but it was too late now, and anyway, surely they would give her a uniform. As all these thoughts raced through her mind, Morpheus finally descended in front of her, in white statue form, head wings flapping. She smiled at him, but his face was stern, so she stopped, realizing that this was a solemn occasion.
"Delwyn of the Realms,"
Morpheus boomed. Delwyn nodded and said, "Yes," and curtsied.
"Silence!"
he roared. Delwyn wondered why he was so angry. She turned to look at the silver bat again, but it had flown up into space to intercept a floating platform. It was also black and shiny, but a little smaller. As it floated down, she could see that it was shrouded in a kind of silvery black mist. It docked next to where Varun was standing, and he and the grey bat stood guard as Morpheus continued to speak.
"Delwyn of the Realms, 2 mistakes you have made."
He stepped aside for the brown bat to fly over to her, bringing 2 scrolls, one in each foot. "Mistakes?" she whimpered.
"Silence!"
Morpheus thundered again. Delwyn saw on the brown bat's wings the name written in black veins, Phobator. She knew instantly that he was one of Morpheus's brothers, so the grey one must have been Phantasus. Phobator handed her both scrolls, and she nodded, not daring to speak again. Her mind was racing with Morpheus's words. She had made 2 mistakes. She looked at Morpheus to see if she was allowed to open the scrolls. He nodded, so she opened the first one, holding back tears, and read quietly to herself. "First error committed by Delwyn of the Realms, leaving the void without her troops." She looked up at Morpheus, wanting so desperately to speak, but she saw Varun over his shoulder shaking his head. Her troops? What troops?
"Next scroll,"
Morpheus commanded. Delwyn looked over both Morpheus's and Varun's shoulders at the platform and wondered what was under the mist. Was it her punishment? She started shaking with fear and the tears ran down her cheeks. Maybe she should have stayed with Greg. She pried open the second scroll and read, "Second error committed by Delwyn of the Realms, failure to complete task, last sorrow." This time she couldn't keep her mouth shut. "What? I did!" she howled.
"Silence!"
Morpheus raged again. "Oh, silence yourself," she snapped. Everyone gasped, including Morpheus.
Insolent human!
He bellowed.
Phobator!
Morpheus waved his brother over, and the brown bat flew at Delwyn and morphed into a giant black tarantula, landing with a terrible thud on the floor directly in front of her. She screamed in pure terror but couldn't move. It reared up at her, its fangs dripping with green venom, only inches away from her head. She could see her face reflected in its horrifying eyes and the green drops perpetually glistening on its fangs. She continued screaming as its side legs grabbed her, but then Varun yelled out, "Apologize, stupid woman!" Morpheus spun around and glared at Varun, but didn't scold him. Delwyn yelled, I'm sorry, please stop!" In an instant, the spider morphed back into Phobator, who gently flew back to his post. Delwyn collapsed on the ground, sobbing and feeling the urge to vomit.
Delwyn of the Realms, collect yourself,
Morpheus commanded. She slowly stood up, crying but doing her best to control it. She had to try hard not to lunge at Morpheus. It was strange how she wasn't the least bit angry at Phobator. Morpheus lowered the volume of his voice and addressed her.
Delwyn, you entered Alethea without your troops. However, it has been brought to my attention that you faded away, so you will be given a second chance. You will meet your troops this night.
Delwyn was having difficulty controlling the sobbing, but as Morpheus could see that she was doing her best and that she'd controlled the urge to vomit, he made an unusual gesture and materialized a handkerchief. He floated closer, handed it to her, and stroked her cheek in front of everyone. They all exchanged glances, but held their positions, afraid of their Ural's wrath. Delwyn took it, blew her nose, and nodded her appreciation, still too afraid to speak. Morpheus stepped back and continued.
Delwyn, you were given the task of facing your last sorrow. You mistook it as one inflicted on yourself. You failed to understand that your last sorrow indicated the pain you have inflicted on others.
He waved the grey bat over, and Delwyn could see the name Fantasis written in silver veins on his wings. Delwyn cringed a little, but he had a scroll in his feet. She took it and opened it. It read, Portal Stormer Initiation Task for Delwyn of the Realms. Second Chance. Last sorrow to be faced in the realm of Nadar. Troop support? Yes. Class? Portal Stormer. Level? Various. Remember, failure to achieve task will result in deportation to Alethea. No further attempts. After Delwyn rolled the scroll up with the others, they all vanished. Varun was now allowed to approach her. All right then, that went well, he said, turning a relaxed beige as Morpheus transformed into a large white bat and flew off with his brothers back to the cave of the Ural. Delwyn tried not to cry, as she was confused, tired, and still afraid of what was under the mist. Varun saw her peering over his shoulder at the platform. Well, are you ready to meet the other stormers? Are they human? She asked feebly, twisting her hair around her fingers. Oh, good God, no. One is plenty. He smiled kindly at her, his eyes letting her know that all was forgiven, even though she had a sneaking suspicion that it was only the calm before the storm. They walked towards the platform, and Delwyn could see that the mist was more like trillions of shiny black polka dots buzzing around each other, forming a force field. She could vaguely see shapes moving about inside it. Varun, where are they from? Tell me about them so I'm prepared. Nothing is going to prepare you for what you are about to see, and I couldn't do them justice anyway. Besides, I don't have all day. I do have one soul to take care of. He saw that Delwyn was shaking in anticipation or fear. He put his webbed hand on her shoulder and said, Relax, Delwyn. They won't hurt you. They're your troops. You will be leading them. "But I don't know anything about Nadar, whatever it is," she whined. Varun covered his ears. "Oh, the whining. I never want to hear that again, Delwyn." He sighed as he grabbed her by the shoulders. "The Stormers know all about Nadar. They will teach you. And remember, you're Delwyn of the Realms. Act like it. You know, leadership, girlie." He laughed as though it was a great joke and clapped his hands. The polka dots buzzed like static and then completely vanished. Delwyn couldn't believe her eyes, but that was happening a lot lately. Standing on the platform were 4 entities. They came down onto the floor and stopped when they were 6 feet away from Delwyn and Varun. Starting from the left was what could only be described as a planet-headed man. His head was the size of a basketball and was mostly green like the Earth, with rivers, oceans and lakes. It also had mountains and its own atmosphere, and there were white, fluffy clouds floating around it. He was only 5 feet tall, had a grey humanoid body. He was barefoot and wearing a black lap across his loins. He had a thick notebook and pencil attached by a chain around his neck, resting against his stomach. When Delwyn looked closer, she could have sworn that she saw something red peering through the clouds on the planet head. She didn't want to appear rude and tried her best not to stare. Next to him was a tall, voluptuous, cat-headed woman. The cat head was white, short-haired, and she had large blue eyes. She was decked out like a soldier, albeit in khaki tank top and shorts, but had no weapons. She didn't look like she needed any, though, as her physique was strong. She had several dragon tattoos on her creamy humanoid skin and was also wearing a pair of mean hobnail boots. Next to the cat-headed woman was a black humanoid man who was covered in tiny black feathers. They were no longer or wider than a centimetre, apart from his face, neck, the palms of his hands, and Delwyn assumed the soles of his feet. He had a large third eye in the middle of his forehead. It was multicoloured and swirled continuously. Delwyn found that it made her dizzy just to look at it, but it was hard not to. The last entity was the strangest, as it literally had no form unless it decided to morph into one, which it was doing on and off, as it was a cloud or swarm of pink vapour. At first, Delwyn thought it was an infestation that they'd brought with them accidentally. One second it was vapour, the next a humanoid or animal cloud. One thing that Delwyn had noticed was the emblem on the planet head's lap, as well as the Catwoman's tank top, and in the black swirl of feathers on the stomach of the third eye man. They were all in the design of a heart with a rose inside it with beams shooting out. She'd seen it somewhere before. When she thought about this, the vapour entity shaped itself into the same emblem. Delwyn gasped when she saw this, but Varun took her by the arm and guided her over for the introductions, as he didn't have all day. Starting with the planet-headed man, who straightened his lap and notebook in preparation, Varun said, "Delwyn, I'd like you to meet Premlus, the last of their kind." The planet-headed man held out his hand for her to shake. Delwyn took it uncertainly and shook it and smiled nervously and turned to Varun, whispering, "Last of their kind? What do you mean? There's only one." Then she heard a voice call out, "I'm Lus, down here on the planet." Delwyn looked down and saw a small red man on the planet, standing on a mountain top, waving his arms frantically to get her attention. If it had been a microcosm of Earth, he would have been a giant. He continued yelling, although it wasn't too loud, considering his size. "He's Prem, my world!" Lust, the little red man, was pointing down to the planet head. "Oh, nice to meet you, Lus," she said, leaning in slightly and then leaning back and declaring, "I'm happy to meet you too, Prem." They stopped shaking hands and Prem started writing on his notebook. Lus yelled out, "Is he writing under me?" Delwyn didn't know what he meant, but Varun told him to be quiet. He put his little hands on his hips and stomped back down the mountain. Prem held up his notebook and it read, "Very proud to make your acquaintance, Delwyn." She smiled and said, "Me too." Before she could walk on to meet the Catwoman, Prem scrawled again and held it up to show her. It read, "I am also a writer." Delwyn grinned appreciatively. "Wonderful, that's great." Even though she knew that it was a bizarre scenario and that they were bizarre characters, there was something about the whole thing that sat right with her. She felt as though she knew them, somehow. They stopped in front of the Catwoman, who was reminiscent of Dr. Purr. However, Delwyn felt that it might be impolite to mention him, just in case. The Catwoman was standing at attention, but had a surly air about her. Delwyn sensed that she wasn't too happy to be there. "And this delightful creature is Ursula. She's a fine trooper, and we're so pleased that she could join us." Varun saluted, which fell flat as the Catwoman stared blankly at him as though he'd farted. "Creature?" she growled in her throat, raising an eyebrow. "Delightful. You must have mistaken me for someone else." Now. Varun wagged a webbed finger at her and chortled like an old boar. "Let us remember to be on our best behaviour, squaddy." Ursula hissed, but then glanced at Delwyn and mewed gently, although her attempts to appear demure came across as childishly play-acted. "Very pleased to meet you, Ursula. I look forward to getting to know you." Delwyn offered her hand and noticed that Ursula took her sweet time to shake it. It was strange how the feline trooper's actions were a mixture of grace and muscle at the same time. "Likewise, I'm sure," she purred, but tilted her cat head back ever so slightly, holding Delwyn's attention in a move that came across as contrived, like something she'd seen in an old movie. Delwyn let her hand go and felt a little tainted by the interaction. She knew that she'd have to watch her back with Ursula, even though she wasn't necessarily an enemy. They went on to meet the black-feathered man with the third eye that almost nauseated Delwyn. She was surprised to hear Varun telling him to close it. "Come on, Fleet, must you always be scanning?" "Close that cursed window," Varun snapped, although Delwyn had no idea why Varun would be so mean. The man giggled like a schoolboy who'd been caught using a magnifying glass on an anthill. The eyelid closed and she saw that it was gold with miniature scales that glistened. His other two eyes were just like a human's, brown and dreamy. He also had a humanoid face, head and neck. Apart from the tiny black feathers all over his body and the third eye, he might as well have been a man from Earth. Delwyn did her best not to check his nether regions, although there hadn't been anything obvious poking out. Varun sounded tired when he introduced this entity. "Delwyn, meet Fleet. Fleet, meet Delwyn." She reached out and took his feathery hand, and he quickly grasped it with the other one, giggling insanely. She looked at Varun, who rolled his eyes and then shook his head to let her know not to worry. "Make sure he keeps his eyes shut, as he can read anyone's history. He can extrapolate the motivations and therefore the possible futures, so don't be surprised if he knows what you're doing before you do it. Sometimes it can come in handy." Then Varun leaned in and slapped their hands apart. "And sometimes it can be bloody annoying." Fleet continued giggling, and then Ursula bit him on the shoulder. "Ouch!" he wailed, and then pinched her tattooed arm right on the tattooed dragon's snout. "Funny how you didn't see that coming, Featherbrain," Ursula growled. Prem started scrawling angrily on his notebook, and Luss laughed hysterically from the bottom of the mountain. The cloud entity continued to morph into random animal shapes, apparently in a daydream. Then Prem held his notebook out dramatically. Luss asked again, "Is he writing under me?" "Shut up, Luss!" Varun snapped, rubbing his temples in frustration. Prem had written, "No more fighting, I've had enough fighting." He slammed the notebook back into place, and then his cloud started darkening. "I agree, Prem. We're nearly done, then you can take Delwyn on her task," said Varun, sighing. As they moved over in front of the cloud entity, Luss started yelling, "Oh no, not now, Prem!" The dark clouds had started raining on Luss, and he was running for cover. Ursula rubbed Prem's back and apologised. "Terribly sorry, old chap. Did it without thinking. Forgive me?" Prem lifted his head back up and the clouds cleared away, sunshine coming from nowhere. Delwyn saw birds flying over the mountains. "Thank you," Luss called out. "May we continue? I do have work to return to." Varun was losing his temper and his colour was fading to a murky grey. "Delwyn, this is Drade. He, she, it, they. It's hard to define, really. For the most part, she's a she, just to make it easier for you. She comes from an alternate universe, blah blah blah. They'll all tell you their stories when I leave. Suffice it to say, she's a collection of vapours that can morph into any shape and can absorb any substance and penetrate anything, anywhere, and so on and so forth, etc. Varun hung his head as he floated off in the same direction as Morpheus and his brothers. Before he disappeared, he looked back over his shoulder and said to Delwyn, "And please don't muck this up, silly woman. Listen to your fellow stormers. They will guide you." With that he disappeared like a bursting bubble. Delwyn turned back to the portal stormers with a horrified look on her face. Ursula started rubbing her hands together with glee. "Are you up for an adventure, Delwyn of the Realms?" Meanwhile, back on Alethea, Gwen was dragging herself out of her car to check her letterbox after shopping in town to pick up supplies. Her head was clouded with the chores she still needed to do, the fence posts that needed to be replaced, her ailing health, and wondering how Greg was going in Melbourne. She'd nearly given up hope, but when he'd called the night before and told her what was happening, her heart skipped a beat. If anyone could flush Delwyn out, it was Greg. She grabbed a handful of junk mail, and as she got into the car, a few items dropped onto the ground. She swore, which wasn't like her at all, and got back out to snatch them up. Her neck was hurting and she thought, "I don't need this shit," as she fought back tears. She grabbed a detergent sample card, the supermarket catalogue and the Historical Society newsletter when she saw a plain envelope with no stamp on it. Her first name was written in blue ink, but that was it. She nearly fainted as she stood up and held it closer to her face. It was Delwyn's handwriting. Straight away she dropped the other mail and ripped the envelope open, hands shaking and barely breathing. She pulled out the letter and opened it with trembling fingers, tears already flooding her face. As she read, her heart started puffing up again, filling with love for the daughter she never had. She read it 3 times over before tucking it into the pocket of her jacket, but as she drove up the driveway to the cottage, the rage started hardening her heart into a knotted fist. As she pulled to a stop, she was pummeling the steering wheel, swearing for all she was worth, wishing that Delwyn was in front of her so she could slap her stupid. How dare she take off like that after all she'd done for her? How could she have put her through all that pain and misery, only to drop a short and sweet note in her letterbox to say, "Hey, no sweat, I'm fine, so sorry, catch you on the flip side." Before she even got out of the car, she rummaged in her handbag for her mobile phone, eventually throwing things out onto the passenger seat in a temper, trying to find it. When she finally located the phone, angry tears started pouring down her cheeks, and she dialed Greg to let him know that the no-good will-o'-the-wisp was okay and not to worry. She sat there fuming as it rang and rang, but finally it went to voicemail and she left an angry message. "Greg, it's Gwen. I have a note, hand-delivered by Delwyn. It was in my letterbox. She didn't even come in." She trailed off and started to bawl, but thought better of it and continued talking through the anguish. "So, there's no need to bother looking for her. She's out there, tripping the light fantastic, finding herself. You're too good for her, Greg. Come home." As she hung up, she collapsed into a sea of sobs, her still beautiful face resting wearily in her hands, silently begging for mercy. It took another 15 minutes before she calmed down enough to gather herself together and to get out of the car. Delwyn had other things on her mind. She was standing on the shiny black floor with the other portal stormers, not feeling up to an adventure at all. She'd just finished meeting the strangest beings, including what she'd seen in her dreams and hallucinations, but had been attacked by a bat that morphed into a giant spider. She was now supposed to travel to a dark world to face all the sorrows she'd ever inflicted throughout her life, with creatures she didn't know and really couldn't trust yet. She knew nothing about Nadar and nothing about them. It was confusing and frightening, to say the least, and she felt naked without Varun or someone she knew at her side. Looking at them all, she decided that she couldn't choose who she'd prefer to speak to about where they were going, how they were going to get there, and what to expect. Ursula came across as conniving and quite a drama queen. She seemed to be a combination of a screen siren from the 1930s and a psychotic warrior woman. Drade kept throwing out random signs and symbols, and seeing as she wasn't humanoid and couldn't speak, was a dead loss to Delwyn. Fleet was a giggling idiot, and she didn't think she could trust anything he might have to say. Besides, he was creepy and could scan her at any moment, which freaked her out and made her sick to the stomach. Last, but certainly not least, was Premlas. Fair enough, Prem could write, but that would take ages, and he seemed to be a little emotional. Luss was the only one that seemed reasonably sane and apparently capable of intelligent discussion, but when she leaned in to address him, Prem started writing on his notebook, causing Luss to repeat his silly question again. "Is he writing under me?" Then Ursula stepped in and hissed at Luss. "Enough with that stupid question, you walking morsel!" Delwyn tried to intervene and calm the situation before it got out of hand, but Prem held up a message that read, "Let's talk about where we'll go first, and don't let the others boss you around. You're in charge, Delwyn." He ripped off the page and handed it to her, but Ursula snatched it playfully. "Oh, really? Nice, that is." She spun around dramatically and crossed her arms in a huff. "What did it say? Tell me!" Luss yelled. "This is ridiculous. Everyone calm down," Delwyn said in her best reasonable voice. Fleet began scanning the scene, cackling and fluffing his tiny feathers with excitement. Ursula swung to scratch him but missed, growling and spitting. "Stop that! Shut it before I scratch it out!" He giggled like a child who'd had too much sugar and darted recklessly out of her way, singing,
"No one is prettier than Ursula. No one is mightier than Ursula."
Ursula screamed like several cats at once, chasing him on all fours, the hair on her head standing up like the hair on a cat's back. He raced around, squealing and singing, "Remember, remember." Prem was scrawling and tearing notes off his book, thundering clouds raining on Luss as he yelled out, "Stop it, everyone! Stop it now! Prem!" There was a tornado brewing in one of the cloud systems, and he screamed, "No!" and started running for shelter. Delwyn stood back in shock, not knowing what to do. Then Drade shifted over to her and signed the question mark symbol at her, then an exclamation point. Delwyn yelled, "I don't know what to do!" Drade formed a flashing red arrow and pointed it at Premlas. The tornado was chasing Luss and getting closer and closer as Prem wrote his words of woe in lightning speed, page after page, ripping and writing. Delwyn looked back at Fleet and Ursula, who were now rolling over each other, black feathers puffing and flying off into the air with a spray of blood. Ursula had scratches on her creamy skin, and one of her dragon tattoos had been marred. Furious, she bit hard into his thigh, and he screamed unholy terror, finally directing his eye towards her in a beam of red light, burning her cheek. Delwyn was twisting her hair with both hands, panicking and hyperventilating, and when she looked over at Drade, she saw flashing warning symbols of all kinds, in combinations of black, red, and orange. Then she heard a blood-curdling bellow coming from Luss. She ran over and grabbed Prem's hands and then yanked them away from the book. "Stop it, Prem! Calm down! You're killing him!" she yelled, as she saw Luss whizzing around inside the tornado. Fleet and Ursula stopped fighting as soon as they heard Delwyn and ran over to Premluss. Prem was trying to calm himself down and the clouds were clearing, but the tornado flung Luss out of the atmosphere, turning him into a fireball. He flew directly at Delwyn and she instinctively spat at him, which sent him tumbling back to the plane. He was smouldering as he thumped on the ground and was seemingly unconscious. They were all huddled around Premluss, staring to see what would happen next. He didn't move as he was stuck in Delwyn's spit. Ursula gasped as she held her bleeding arm. "What if he's drowning?" Delwyn said, "Prem, dry him with the wind." She didn't know how or why she knew, or if it would work. Prem sent the winds to Luss and he dried out, but he was still not moving. Delwyn looked over at Fleet, who was surprisingly solemn when he said,
"He will live."
Prem slowly started writing, but Ursula said, "No, enough of that, Prem." Then they all heard a faint voice. "Is he writing under me?" They all laughed and Drade flashed exclamation marks and happy faces. Prem held up the note that said, "So sorry, Luss, please forgive me." As the troops made friends and hugged each other, Ursula and Fleet licking their wounds, Delwyn walked off for a minute and then spun around, realising that she had to take control of this group of dangerous nitwits. "Okay, nutballs, everyone, come on, turn around and pay attention." They slowly turned around, obviously slightly perturbed that this human thought she could speak to them in this manner. Ursula crossed her arms and slanted her head, dripping with insolence. Fleet pretended that he didn't care by smoothing his feathers, but he looked up occasionally to see what Delwyn was going to say or do next. Drade morphed into Rodan's thinking man, showing her sarcastic side. Premluss stood to attention, the two of them, as they were miraculously back to normal. Delwyn took a deep breath. "If I'm to be your leader, there's to be no more fighting." She was interrupted by Prem clapping his hands. "Okay, Prem, shh." He straightened up and motioned for her to continue. "I'm new to this game and I need to learn all that you know, as well as everything about you. I don't want to go to Nadar unprepared." Luss interrupted this time and said, "Very good idea. We should go to Meditar first." The others nodded and started chattering excitedly. Delwyn's interest was piqued. "Why Meditar?" Drade flashed the yin and yang symbol, then the peace sign, and many other signs and sigils that dealt with knowledge, life, and introspection. Ursula seemed terribly happy with the idea and was very forthcoming with the reasons why they should go. Delwyn tried not to be suspicious. "Meditar is the realm of contemplation and meditation, but it's not all about navel-gazing. If you seek enlightenment and information, then Meditar is the place to go." Fleet's feathers were standing erect and he picked up where Ursula left off.
"You'll learn all you'll need to know about Nadar when we're there. We've been and we can tell you about our experiences, but it's different for everyone."
Then Drade flashed a terrible image of a horrified face. Delwyn nearly fell over. "What in the hell was that for, Drade?" she demanded. Drade blushed pink and then morphed into a teardrop. "What she's trying to say is it's not a happy place, Delwyn," Luss chimed in. "You'll have to keep your wits about you, but it's the perfect place to test your mettle." Delwyn looked down and wondered where she'd heard that before. Maybe in a dream or back on Alethea. She thought she remembered Varun saying something to that effect. She looked up and asked, "Do we go to Meditar via meditation?" The portal stormers laughed, and Fleet laughed way too much, as was obviously usual for him. When the others stopped, they stared at him, utterly annoyed, until he finally fizzled out.
"So sorry,"
he said mockingly and slightly embarrassed. Ursula answered the question. "We go in physical form. You'll see the map when we get there. Nadar, Alethea and Meditar are on the same axis." "That's not the right word," Luss yelled out. It will do, Ursula said patiently, but through gritted teeth. As all three realms are on the same axis, we can enter them in physicality, but the Bodhisattva will explain it all to you. Delwyn knew what a Bodhisattva was and didn't want to ask who, what, or why at this stage, as she was already excited to go, even though she felt uneasy with this bunch of lunatics. Then she asked, So, how do we get there? Ursula pointed to the platform. We can hitch a ride on that magic carpet. Fleet started chuckling and nearly choked on his own tongue.
It's not a magic carpet, Percy, it's a goompa.
Don't call me that! She leaned in to swipe at him, but then looked back at Delwyn, who gave her a warning glance, so she stepped back and smoothed down her cat hair. Only my real friends can call me that, she said snobbishly. Delwyn ignored her and walked over to the goompa, slowly stepped up on it, and then waved the troops over. It felt strange to be taking charge in a realm such as One-Soul, although she'd never really taken charge anywhere. As they all hopped on, Ursula whispered to Delwyn, Good, that place was giving me the creeps. Once they were all aboard, the silvery black polka dot mist covered them like a billowy blanket, and then stiffened and formed into a curved dome over the goompa, creating a large sealed room. It was like a spaceship, but without controls. Delwyn turned to Ursula and asked, How does it fly if no one controls it? She noticed that the troops' dispositions had changed since they departed from One-Soul. They were somewhat calmer. Fleet and Premluss were sitting cross-legged on the floor, side by side, like children in a classroom. Drade had morphed into a floating pink orb, quietly hovering between Delwyn and Ursula. Ursula stood at ease, with her hands clasped behind her back and her feet slightly apart, as a soldier would when speaking with a superior. Our collective minds are propelling the craft. It's merely the vessel and we are the impetus. We've already stated our desired destination and will arrive shortly. There was no purring or melodramatic gestures, however she still retained an air of mystique. Thank you, Ursula, that was really informative. I appreciate it very much. Delwyn was impressed and hoped that this was the real portal stormer and not the crazy hellcat she'd just seen on One-Soul. I aim to please, illustrious leader. Well, there it was, her flair for theatrics. Delwyn smiled and noticed that Premluss was writing and nodding. She heard Luss talking as Prem wrote. Fleet had fallen asleep, and as he snored, his feathers gently ruffled. She went over to see what was happening as Ursula and Drade communed. As her back was turned, Drade shifted into the shape of a humanoid female, complete with floor-length gown. She seemed to like being in that format, although she also seemed embarrassed to present herself that way in front of a real human. As Delwyn turned around briefly and caught her, she blushed a rosy red and morphed back into a floating pink ball. Delwyn crouched down in front of Premluss and asked quietly, "What's going on here, then?" Luss, who was still a little charred from his ordeal, ran up the mountain to speak to her. Prem wrote a quick note and held it up for Luss to see. "Don't yell. Fleet is sleeping." He put the notebook back down as Luss reached the top of the little mountain and caught his breath. "We have to talk to each other sometimes to keep everything shipshape, you know?" Delwyn couldn't even imagine what it would take for a creature like Premluss to keep healthy. "Oh, okay, fair enough." Prem started writing as Luss continued explaining how they had to work together to keep the balance. Every time Prem tried to show what he had written, Luss interrupted, and then Prem would write something else, until finally Delwyn said, "Hang on, Luss, Prem's trying to show me something." She looked at the note and it read, "Is he talking over me?" She laughed. Now she realized what was going on between the two of them, but then she wondered why it was such a big deal. "Yes, he's talking over you, and sometimes you write under him, so you're both even, okay?" Luss laughed and Prem nodded, and then held out another note. It said, "We're so happy you have found us, Delwyn. We've waited a long time for you." Delwyn looked at them quizzically, but then was distracted by Fleet's snoring. She saw that his eyelid fluttered and the eye was turned upwards like a human eye. As she watched it, she saw Drade out of the corner of her own eye and spun around, catching her in full humanoid form. "Drade!" she yelled excitedly, waking Fleet up, which didn't matter as he drifted back a second later. Drade panicked and morphed into the first thing that seemed to pop into her mind, which was a blue donkey. "I'm sorry," whispered Delwyn, inching towards her. "It's okay. Go into whatever makes you feel comfortable." Drade blushed all over again in a deep shade of red, but slowly drifted back into her female form, which shimmered like a pale pink ghost. Ursula smiled encouragingly, and Delwyn joined in, saying, "I like you that way. I can relate to you now." Drade glowed a rosier pink and smiled with her pretty face, even though it was slightly creepy. All three females stood together as their ship took them to Meditar, discussing their fears for Nadar and how they would support each other. Premlus continued taking inventory, and Fleet slept on, dreaming his crazy dreams. It was as though their craft wasn't moving at all. There was no turbulence or sound, and Delwyn was disappointed that there weren't any windows. Ursula scoffed. "Who cares about flashing colours and streaks of light? Been there, done that." Delwyn advised that even though she'd seen a lot of crazy stuff and been to a lot of strange places, she would still like to see what was out there. Drade flashed an image of the map of the realms, a soul astral travelling, and then an arrow at Delwyn. "Yes, I know, I've seen the realms from that vantage point, but I'd still like to see. I don't want to miss out on anything." Ursula snorted. "You won't. Trust me." Before long, the shimmering black force field started buzzing. Fleet woke up and yawned, his third eye flickering along with his normal eyes. As they all got up and prepared to disembark, Ursula took Fleet by the arm and said, "Remember, no scanning. Keep it closed or they'll throw you out." "Why?" asked Delwyn, starting to get nervous, even though she knew that this was supposed to be a relatively harmless realm. "They like order and tranquility here, and the visitors don't like having their innermost thoughts infiltrated. The same reason that you don't like it, Master." Ursula grinned mischievously at Delwyn. "All right, enough with the sarcasm, squatty," Delwyn said, borrowing Viron's nickname for her. Ursula was obviously surprised and smiled at her, seemingly pleased that Delwyn had some kind of a sense of humour. As the force field started fading, Lusp gasped and said, "I can't wait, it's been so long." Fleet ruffled his feathers and preened as he straightened his back, apparently desperate to impress whoever they were going to meet. He giggled as he said,
"Must be on my best behaviour this time."
Drade stayed in human female form but kept switching her dresses, finally opting for one that matched Delwyn's. Her body and hair remained pink, but the dress was black, although made from the same shiny mist as the rest of her. Delwyn noticed that Drade paid special attention to her, copying certain facial expressions and gestures. When the force field finally disappeared, Delwyn nearly stopped breathing as she was taken aback by the beautiful scene in front of them. They'd landed in the middle of a serene landscape that could have been straight out of a picture book. It was a mild, sunny day, and the green meadows and mountains stretched on forever. To their left was a quaint, winding walkway that led to what seemed to be a Japanese country township, complete with simple houses and temples, neat little gardens and lanterns hanging along the walkways, swinging gently in the breeze. The faint scent of sandalwood incense wafted through the air, and the soothing sounds of wind chimes, little bells, and chanting completed the intoxicating mood. Ursula led the way down the path, and as they walked by some of the houses, they could hear intermittent flute playing, gongs, and thoughtful discussions. A man in a beige suit sauntered by, followed by several ducks, a little piglet, and a small chimp carrying scrolls. Delwyn was thrilled and said, "How delightful!" The man had his hands clasped behind his back, and he smiled and nodded as they went by. The monkey waved the scrolls at them and laughed, making Fleet laugh insanely.
I love him,
he gushed, then his eye opened mid-giggle. He closed it manually with his right forefinger. Ursula had prepared to pounce on him, but she eventually dropped back. There were cherry blossoms and maple trees everywhere, wisteria, bamboo and all kinds of bonsai. Delwyn saw every kind of Buddha statue as well as other strange deities and objects that she'd never seen before. There were spaces with tables and chairs for tea ceremonies, and other gathering places for conversation and study. Pebbled walkways led to koi ponds and other bodies of water that included waterfalls and fountains. In one direction there were scattered groups of people, animals, spirits and mysterious creatures doing Tai Chi, meditation or martial arts in open fields. In another direction there were groups of entities teaching each other to do calligraphy, origami, growing strange plants or playing peculiar musical instruments. She saw a platform where monkeys and dogs were learning how to dance like dragons. In a stone and cactus garden she saw monks contemplating nothingness, while geometric shapes zigzagged all around, trying to distract them. It was magical and peaceful, and Delwyn wanted to stay forever. What surprised her the most was the occasional guard, looking like a samurai, meandering here and there, obviously keeping the peace. As they made their way down the path towards a group of buildings on a hill, one of the guards came up to them and stopped Fleet with a staff across his chest, gently but firmly. "I believe your name is Fleet, is it not?" the guard asked politely in a clipped British accent. Fleet stood still and looked sideways at Delwyn, his golden eyelid clamped tightly.
"Yes,"
he giggled nervously.
"But I'm behaving myself, sir."
He continued giggling quietly, trying his best not to, but he couldn't help it, such was his nature. As the guard prepared to question him further, another guard came up behind them, swinging his staff, whistling and smiling with his eyes. They were both dressed in the style of samurai warriors, but their armour was multicoloured with the emblem they'd seen on all the buildings, fences and gates. It was a large, ornate M, entwined with a slender golden dragon. The second guard was much larger than the first, and he came up next to Delwyn, still swinging his staff, looking at the first guard. They both had strangely patterned antlers on their helmets, made of delicate scroll work and symbols she hadn't seen before. He stopped whistling and said to Delwyn,
"Is this your party, madam?"
He peered around her head as though he was looking around a corner to sneak a look at something. He smiled as he waited for her to respond. She stammered, "Yes, sir." The guard came around in front of her, holding the staff at his side.
"Oh, fear not, madam. We're only doing our job,"
he said sincerely.
"It's just that your chicken friend has caused trouble here before with his roving eyeball, making everyone sick and stealing their thoughts."
Fleet's feathers ruffled.
"It wasn't stealing,"
he retorted, still giggling, but angrily with a hint of nervousness. The first guard knocked him playfully on the head with his staff. "Shush now, bird brain. Don't get uptight. We can't have you running amok." Ursula seemed to take a fancy to the guards and acted like she wanted to assure them that she would take personal responsibility for Fleet, but Delwyn beat her to it. "It's all right. We're portal stormers. I'm their leader. I'll make sure he behaves himself. I promise." Drade shook her head and Premlus shuffled their feet with embarrassment. Ursula shot Delwyn a look that seemed to say, "Big mouth," but was surprised with the big guard's response.
"Oh, we know you're portal stormers. Word gets around. But you're a Lethian, a human, aren't you?"
he said, smiling at Delwyn. The smaller one prodded her arm. "So?" She tried to regain her composure.
"Well, why should a human be allowed to lead anyone? They destroy everything they touch. They can't be trusted."
The guards both laughed, and as Delwyn began to try to speak her mind, Ursula placed her hand over her mouth and flashed her cobalt eyes at them. "Meow, meow," which sounded more like a meow. Gentlemen, please. She was chosen for a reason. Besides, it's not nice to pick fights with girls, is it? The smaller guard started twirling his staff again as the big guard released Fleet and shrugged his shoulders.
No one's picking a fight, pussycat. Merely maintaining order, but we'll be watching you.
The smaller one wasn't finished with them. Before you go, state your business here. He directed the question at Delwyn. She glanced at Ursula, not sure how to answer, but Ursula gave her a nudge and Drade morphed into an exclamation mark. Well, we're here to see the Bodhisattva. The smaller guard snorted and said, Which one? There are lots of them here on Meditar. Ursula piped up and said, Tiro. Now, would you mind? She gestured for them to get out of the way. The larger guard seemed surprised. He raised his eyebrows at the smaller one and mouthed, Tiro. The smaller one also raised his eyebrows and jiggled his head sarcastically, which indicated to Delwyn that Tiro must have been an important Bodhisattva.
Very well then, off you go, portal stormers.
The large guard nearly spat as they walked past. When they were out of earshot, Delwyn asked, What's so bad about being a portal stormer? Luss answered her, It depends on where you come from. On Alethea, as you would know, it means you're crazy. Where Prem and I come from, it's shameful. Ursula interjected, Where I come from, it means you're a renegade. I should have been a lady of leisure, she said dramatically, as she started rolling her hips and elegantly gesturing with her hands as she walked. Fleet sniggered and said,
I'm exalted where I come from. It's an honour to be a gatecrasher.
They all laughed, apart from Drade, who smiled and morphed into a thumbs-up sign. Prem translated for her by writing, Her kind are supposed to be portal stormers. Luss answered, It's expected. That's why they were created, until the program was pulled. She's the last of her kind. Delwyn was intrigued. Program? Where? Ursula continued, From her home planet. She ran away before they could downgrade her. Delwyn was confused. She's from another planet? Fleet guffawed.
We're all from other planets in other systems, silly Delwyn.
Don't worry. The Master will fill you in. Ursula wrapped her arm around Delwyn as they walked up the path that led to the small hill. Delwyn's mind was now struggling with the idea of her troops coming from actual planets, other worlds in the galaxy, or galaxies, if that's what Fleet had meant. She'd thought that they were simply entities from different realms, but that didn't mean the same thing, did it? Her head started to hurt as they made their way up the gentle slope, past old women sitting in circles, silently weaving baskets. When they approached the top of the hill, she saw that there was a lovely fern garden, with little chubby Buddha statues and small bamboo fountains, making gentle sounds of trickling water and occasional hollow thuds. Behind the fern garden was a small brown house, which looked like the traditional Japanese houses that Delwyn had seen on Alethea. A young woman was cooking something over a little fire pit out the front, and as they approached her, she stood and bowed, then went inside. Ursula whispered to Delwyn, I think they knew that we were coming. As they stood near the fire pit, Delwyn noticed the delicious scent of stewed pork, star anise, orange, steamed rice and green vegetables. She noticed that her stomach was growling ferociously. It had been a while since she had eaten, but she never noticed being hungry in one soul. She turned to Ursula and asked her about it. The time frames are the same here as they are in Alethea and Nadar, so maybe that's why you're hungry. I ate before we went to One Soul, and I only eat seafood from any realm. Drade doesn't eat, however she gets her energy simply from communicating with others. In a vacuum or left on her own, she would soon perish. Delwyn was fascinated to learn these new things about her troops. Ursula went on to explain that Luss found his own food on the planet, and Prem fed on Luss's waste from every orifice, including what he exhaled, which was similar to carbon dioxide. Fleet ate worms and maggots, which did not surprise Delwyn, but what did surprise her was that he also enjoyed a snake or two here and there when he could get his hands on one. As she assimilated this information, she saw the young woman coming out of the house, smiling and tying her hair back up into a bun. Delwyn didn't want to be rude, but her stomach dictated precedence. "Excuse me, would it be impolite to ask who that food is for?" "Certainly not. It's for you, Delwyn of the Realms." The young woman smiled with her pretty face, and her black hair shone like obsidian in the sun. Delwyn clapped her hands together like a greedy child as the woman rolled up the sleeves of her yellow tunic dress and served a big steaming plate of the wonderful food for her. Premlus had already found a spot under one of the maple trees to write and reflect, whilst Fleet searched the ground for worms and Ursula watched Delwyn eat with unrestrained gusto. The young woman seemed pleased with the happy sounds emanating from Delwyn, and before long a tall, handsome man came striding out to the front veranda of the house. He seemed to be of Japanese descent, and his head was shaved. He had a slight goatee and was wearing blue and brown robes almost like a Buddhist monk. The koromo was navy blue and the rakusu was brown, with the emblem for Meditar on the front of it. He was barefoot and bareheaded and sat down in the lotus position on a large gold silk mat, waiting for Delwyn to be brought to him. She hurriedly finished the rest of her food, and the pretty woman took her by the hand, saying, "I take you to Master Tiro now." Delwyn wiped her hands down the sides of her dress and nodded, hoping that she wouldn't emit any noises after wolfing her food down so quickly. Ursula started walking with them, but Master Tiro held his left hand up and said calmly, "No, only Delwyn." Ursula knew better than to react dramatically or childishly, so she turned around and went off to join Drade, who was watching the fish in the koi pond, still in female humanoid form. She whispered to Delwyn before she went off, "Maybe I can snatch a carp before anyone notices." The young woman led Delwyn up to Master Tiro, who smiled warmly at her, but didn't rise to greet her. He gestured over to a purple mat to his right side for her to sit on, which she did. "I've been looking forward to your arrival, Delwyn. I'm so glad that you could come." His voice was soft and soothing, but there was a vein of power resonating somewhere within. Delwyn felt like a girl on her first date and wanted to make a good impression, but she had hundreds of questions performing leapfrog in her mind. She did her best to keep her cool. "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Master Tiro. Thank you so much for receiving us." So far, so good. She felt confident for once in these strange realms. "With pleasure. There's so much I need to tell you, and so little time, unfortunately." Delwyn wondered what he meant, but knew that he would explain, and did her best not to whine, as she could almost see Varun smearing his face with his webbed hands in despair. She would not complain, and would try her utmost not to fiddle with her hair. "Well, I'll do my best to remember and to pay attention. I want to do whatever I can do to help in whatever capacity." "Good. The realms need the portal stormers to be at their peak. Let us start with your questions, of which I am sure you have many." He smiled his terribly winning smile, which nearly made Delwyn swoon. No wonder Ursula wanted to come closer to this alluring man, if he was a man. "Yes, I do have a lot of questions, but I'm not sure how many of them are relevant," she said nervously. "Ah! If you thirst for answers, then denying yourself will leave you wanting." They laughed, and she finally relaxed. Then the young woman came up to them with a tray, complete with teapot, cups, and implements. All three of them fell silent as the woman went through the motions of preparing the tea, and when she finished, she handed Delwyn's cup to her and pointed to a scroll that was hanging up on the wall behind them. It had the emblem for Meditar on it, but it was bigger and different. Delwyn saw that it had the gleaming heart and rose underneath the M. She looked at Master Tiro, who was sipping his tea thoughtfully, and she decided that it was better to save that question for later. She sipped the delicious tea, which tasted like jasmine tea with a hint of honeycomb. When they were done, the woman took the tray away, and Master Tiro turned to her, smiling. "Was that to your satisfaction?" he asked. "Oh, yes, thank you, very nice." He tilted his head and said, "You are not like other humans, Delwyn, with your capacity to travel the realms. You are also wise and compassionate, but young and willful at the same time. Hopefully you can combine those energies and use them to your advantage when the need arises." He waited for her to respond, but she wasn't sure if that was a statement or a hidden question. "Are you talking about Nadar?" she finally asked, not knowing where to begin. He leaned back and looked over at the beautiful garden, seeming to be searching for the right words. He looked as though he had all the right words in the universe already tucked away inside his sagely mind. Eventually he stroked his chin and turned back to her. "For everywhere and anywhere you would need to use them." He started getting up from the mat and motioned for her to do the same. "Would you care for a stroll? I simply adore strolling through Meditar, especially when having an interesting discussion with a portal stormer such as yourself." He extended his hand and she took it, allowing him to lead her down the steps to a path that led to the left of the house and down through some more lovely gardens. As they passed some strange creatures that looked like humanoid crickets working in a rice paddy, Delwyn asked him about her troops. She thought that she might as well learn about them before she asked anything else. Yes, you need to know their backgrounds, particularly before you go to Nadar. Not that you'll have anything to worry about, Delwyn, as I have decided to send one of my best guards with you, just in case." "Just in case? In case of what?" she asked, starting to worry again. He laughed and said, "One topic at a time. Now, let us talk about your feline friend, Ursula." He continued laughing quietly and shaking his head, amusing himself. Delwyn nearly asked him what was so funny, but decided to keep quiet and waited for him to collect his thoughts, which seemed to take a long time. "All your stormers come from different planets in different solar systems. They arrived in this system the last time the planets aligned. Someone arranged it for them to all storm at the same time. We have a hunch who it was, but we are not allowed to say." Delwyn couldn't help interrupting. "Who's we?" she asked excitedly. He stopped walking and looked at her, casually waving to a dragonfly as it meandered by. "Myself and the Ural, of course, the Ural of Meditar. You will meet him once you return from Nadar. It will be necessary for you to do so." "Why?" She knew that she sounded like an annoying child, but that's what she was here for, to get the answers to her questions. He smiled patiently and patted her on the head. She tried not to pout, enduring it with a blank look on her face. "You will find out when the time comes, Delwyn." She was on a roll. "So, if you have a hunch about who arranged for my troops to storm over to our system, then could you tell me?" She smiled like a Cheshire cat at him. He laughed with his head thrown back, and for a minute it made her think of Greg, which gave her a pain in her heart. She swept it away for later, as Master Tiro patted her head again. How she hoped he would stop doing that. "Why would I tell you, Delwyn? You might know him, or her, or it." Delwyn pondered this. Varun? Morpheus? Pasithea? Who else could it be? Her mind boggled with the possibilities. They walked on through a peaceful green field, dotted here and there with weeping willows, and stopped near a giant watermill on the side of a lazy river. Master Tiro had finished explaining the aligning of the planets and the movement of celestial bodies, which Delwyn didn't find very interesting. Then he went back to talking about Ursula as they sat on a bench under a lovely willow tree. "So, Ursula. She hails from a world called Felon, which is a place much like Earth but far more civilized, with an intimidating army. They do prefer, however, to keep to themselves, and they will not trade with their neighbour. That's the planet where Fleet comes from, but I'll tell you about that next. Delwyn nodded and lost herself in his voice. Ursula comes from an aristocratic family, and she was raised by a nervous ninny of a mother who wanted her to grow up and become absorbed in the sheltered society her family had brought her into. Her brothers had all gone off and joined the military, following in their father's footsteps, who passed away a long time ago. He stopped to check that Delwyn was paying attention, which she was. Smiling, he continued. Ursula is a handful and always was. She snuck off, joined the army under a pseudonym, but then they discovered who she was. Before they sent her packing, back to her mother's petticoats, so to speak, they discovered that she had a unique gift, amongst others. Delwyn sat up straight and said, "Yes, go on." He was obviously pleased that she was interested. Ursula can also astral travel. He grinned triumphantly. Delwyn slumped. "Oh, is that all?" She was disappointed, as she half expected to hear that Ursula could morph into magical creatures or could shoot crystal arrows out of her blue eyes. "Well, isn't that good enough for you?" he asked, seemingly surprised and somewhat dejected. "Yes, well, I was hoping that she had special powers or something. But anyway, that's fine. I mean, go on. Sorry." She stammered and started fiddling with her hair, then stopped and winced, remembering that she'd promised herself not to do that. He laughed and went to pat her on the head, but she ducked and, as an afterthought, blushed for having done so. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." He made a pretend sad face, and they both laughed. "So, what happened then?" she asked, trying to make amends. "Well, on Felon, if you have a special power like that, you're considered a threat. Usually they drown citizens who display those talents, but seeing as Ursula came from a military family, they didn't drown her, but sent her for testing, which really meant experimenting. They wanted to learn from her and see if they could use her for spying." "They did that on Earth, Alethea too. It was called remote viewing, and the military also used it for spying, apparently, or according to conspiracy theories, you know." He scratched his goatee and said, "How do you know?" "People write books," she said, bewildered. "Ah, yes, books. Data trapped in tree corpses." "Oh." They said nothing for a minute, and then he continued, leaning back on the bench. "So, on one of her astral journeys, Ursula accidentally travelled into our system and came to Meditar. After being discovered trying to catch a fish, and failing miserably, she disappeared and showed up in one soul. Varun found her flirting with Max Purr, who was horrified, as he first thought she was a ghost. Then she discovered that Max doesn't play with girls, if you know what I mean." Master Tiro was staring off into space, and Delwyn was speechless, staring at the side of his head. After a shocked minute, she asked, "What did you just say to me?" He snapped to and replied, "I don't have time to repeat myself, Delwyn. To cut a long story short, Varun told her to go back to her body and wait for the alignment, but that's all we know, apart from her showing up physically when the alignment happened. Varun swears black and blue that he had nothing to do with her actually getting here, but won't say who did." "Morpheus!" Delwyn blurted. Master Tiro held up his hands and said, "No, Delwyn, be careful. We don't know. We're all in the dark, and until we know for sure, we will not be pointing fingers. Let me impress that on you, most strongly. If our Ural finds out that you're pointing fingers, he'll be very cross, and he doesn't usually lose his temper. Do I make myself clear?" He was quite stern with his handsome eyes, now serious and sagely. "All right, I'm sorry," she replied quietly, sinking into herself. He surprised her by rubbing her arm. "It is fine, Delwyn, but you must remember not to be so impetuous. It could get you into serious trouble." His eyes returned to the kindness that she liked, and she smiled back at him. "Okay, who else? Fleet?" she asked. Master Tiro went on to explain how Fleet was also a natural portal stormer, being able to explore others' thoughts, emotions, memories and motivations through his third eye. He came from the planet Squain, which was only a few light years away from Felon. They were rarely black and were all the colours of the rainbow, but they were humanoid and had third eyes, although they had different powers. Some could only see anger or happiness, love, despair, or other emotions, but only one thing for each being. Fleet was unique as he was considered what Alethians would call challenged or special, and he was ostracised by his family, his community, and society as a whole. Master Tiro advised that it was horrible what his own people did to him, and that Delwyn knew about the story of the chickens who pecked the one black feather. Could she imagine what they did to someone like Fleet, who was covered in them? Somehow Fleet had been spotted by whoever had organised the storming, and was brought across to join the troops. "Hang on," said Delwyn, forgetting who she was talking to. "Fleet said that he was exalted on his planet, that it was an honour to be a gatecrasher, as he called it." She was stunned, but was beginning to develop a little more compassion for Fleet, even though he could be annoying. "Of course he would say that, Delwyn, wouldn't you, after being treated like an outcast by the whole world?" She nodded, and after allowing it to sink in, got back into the swing of it. "What about Drade?" she asked on the edge of her seat. Drade was a program created for the enjoyment of the uber-rich on the planet Sartum. They are physical beings, somewhat humanoid. It's hard to explain. They used to come here to meditate, sometimes, but only via meditation, like most other beings in the realms. However, they wanted to be able to do exactly what you can do, Delwyn, travel to all the realms, but they couldn't. So they invented Drade and her kind to use like a suit or vehicle. The program wraps itself around the being, snug like a stocking. Then they could go to any of the realms, but it backfired, as they somehow brought terrible things back with them. He laughed as he thought about it, but Delwyn thought it was horrible. She didn't say so, but she was beginning to think that Master Tiro had a bit of a sadist in him. Then they thought it was too much trouble, so right before they cut the program forever, the alignment happened, and of course Drade had been earmarked, I assume, for her sensitivities. Anyway, once again, it was arranged for her to storm, and she came through with the others. They sat for a minute watching the willow leaves move gently in the warm breeze. The watermill was turning slowly and the river flowed along, with ducks here and there quacking contentedly. On the one hand she was in a serene zen-like realm, and on the other she was hearing bizarre stories and thinking bizarre thoughts. Master Tiro began talking again, which snapped Delwyn out of her daydream. Last but not least, Premlas. "Yes, yes, please," she pleaded. He told the story of worlds colliding, literally colliding just outside a gigantic black hole. Worlds within worlds begat multiple universes and vice versa as they were sucked into the vacuum and then emerged out the other side through a rip in the space-time continuum. It made no sense to Delwyn, but she was enthralled. Premlas's planet, Dinkray, was born. The beings all had planets for heads with an entity on each planet. The being could not survive if their entity passed away. They lived as a unit and had to work together to stay alive. The same went for the entity. If the being died or was injured badly, the entity could not survive unless they could migrate to another being, which was considered risque and bad for the being. Some migrations were successful, but the entities were notorious for breeding like rabbits, and the beings would be overrun like an infestation. The delicate balance was often thrown out of whack, and death could occur for all parties concerned. The beings could, however, breed together and have perfectly healthy offspring, complete with their own entities. Portal stormers were unheard of until one Dinkranian called Dradsom, years before Premlus was born, started visiting one soul, then Meditar, and on one fateful day Alusol. The shock was too much for Som, who convinced Drad to travel to Nidar, where they perished. From that day on it was forbidden to storm, but when Premlus was born and started showing signs of the gift, his parents banished him. He continued storming to deal with his loneliness, but when the planets aligned, Dinkray was destroyed by the shift, and he stormed along with the other portal stormers. "Wow," said Delwyn, wiping the tears from her face. "No wonder Prem's so emotional." "Yes," said Master Tiro, deep in thought. Then he sat up and rubbed his chin, looking worried. "Is anything wrong?" asked Delwyn anxiously. "Yes and no," he smiled weakly. "Yes, because I have to tell your history. No, because it's probably of no consequence, so maybe there's no point in me telling it." "But I know my history, don't I?" she asked, puzzled. "No, not this one. It's technically not yours." She was confused with his riddles, but wanted to know, whatever it was. "Please tell me," she begged. He sighed and stood up. "I will give you the short version, as I must teach you about Nidar, and time is definitely running out." He reached out his hand, and once again she took it and let him lead her. This time they walked out from under the willow and made their way along the river banks. Several wild horses raced past them, majestic and powerful, and they hardly made a sound. Delwyn craned her neck, hoping that she could see Paxir, but none of them had wings. Master Tiro motioned for Delwyn to follow him on the path to the right, which led to another building further down, amongst some shady trees and tall bamboo. "Delwyn, do you remember your grandmother May, on your father's side?" he asked, walking with his hands behind his back, which seemed to be the way people walked when contemplating things. "Yes, well, I never met her, but I know of her. Why?" Her pulse raced as she was wondering why he would be mentioning her. "Do you remember Jane?" he continued asking as he sauntered along. "Oh, yes, how could I forget her?" She shuddered as she thought about herself as a child being afraid of the gentle, deaf giant with the booming voice. Then she felt guilty for shuddering, since Jane had never hurt her. "Have you ever wondered about the mirror and where it came from?" he asked. Delwyn wondered why he wouldn't get to the point and tell her everything if he was in such a hurry. "Yes, I have. Please tell me. I'm busting to know," she beseeched him. He gave her a sidelong glance and smiled playfully. Why did he have to be so handsome and annoying? "Do you believe in reincarnation?" Another question. Delwyn couldn't contain herself. "Master Tiro, I believe in anything now. Please don't tease me any more." He laughed loudly and seemed like a schoolboy playing a prank. She had to stop herself from smacking him or kissing him. She wanted to do both. "All right, Delwyn, then here it is." He stopped and faced her, getting serious again. "Jane was sent to you when you were young, to protect you. She was the reincarnation of someone you met in one soul. Do you remember Brote?" Delwyn's jaw dropped. "I beg your pardon?" He smiled. "Brote, the Cyclops who guards the Ural's gate that leads to the Void River. He was the soul in Jane's body. She was Brote. May knew, as she became pregnant with Jane, that she had Brote's soul in her body too, and he led her to the mirror and cast the spell to create the portal to one soul. Morpheus wasn't aware, but Brote was working for someone else. Only a few of us know, and it must be kept a secret from Morpheus and Varun. Do you understand?" He had a grave look on his face and then looked about to see that no one was listening. "Why can't they know? What are you not telling me?" Delwyn was dumbfounded. "You will find out more when you return from Nidar. We must go through the motions, and you must become a full-fledged portal stormer before we can see my Ural and go further. Now, say you understand." His eyes were bigger now, as it seemed that panic was setting in. I don't understand, but I'll agree as long as you're on my side. She started shaking with fear, although she didn't exactly know why. He calmed down again and turned to continue walking. They were approaching the building with the shade from the bamboo comforting them. The soft wind rustled the leaves of the trees and they started walking up the steps. Master Tiro bent his head down to Delwyn and said, "Do you remember the eyelid pattern on the bottom of the teacup when Jane made cocoa for you?" "How do you know all this?" she finally asked. "Many minds visit Meditar, including yours, Delwyn." "Oh." She thought about this and then nodded and said, "I remember those eyelids. That was a spell that Jane, or rather Brote, was trying to put on you, for protection, that's all. You wouldn't have it though, would you? You would never drink to the bottom of the cup. Your life could have been simpler had you finished your cocoa." "How?" she asked. "Your mother, your father, Duncan, your own negativity, all those wounds could have been assuaged." She stopped and thought about it, trying to see how her life could have been any simpler with protection. She was bowled over by his next statement, though. "Then you wouldn't have to go to Nadar. Oh well." He slid the door to the side and stepped in, gesturing for her to enter. "How could that have prevented me from having to go to Nadar? Did you mean that I wouldn't have a last sorrow to face?" He looked sternly at her again. "Think, Delwyn. If you were protected from harm, then you wouldn't have lashed out and hurt the people you most loved." As he pulled out a cushion for her to sit on, she felt the tears well up in her eyes. He walked over to a blackboard and grabbed a piece of chalk and a pointer, then turned around to speak, but faltered when he saw her silently weeping. "Delwyn!" he gasped, but didn't move towards her. She wiped the tears and tried to regain control. Apparently doing his best to remain firm, he spoke with a gentler voice, but then started the lesson, as they had a lot to cover.